Leadership is typically about power or authority or control. Historically, people have pursued leadership in order to really advance themselves. For example, princes have betrayed their fathers in order to be in charge. Emperors have killed whoever got in their way in order to expand their empires. Even today, we see self interested leaders, right? Narcissists run for office and pursue fame. Managers micromanage. Corporate executives, they make cutthroat layoffs. School administrators, they run off their critics. Pastors, they protect their position. However, in the 1970s, a business scholar named Robert Greenleaf developed a theory of leadership, which he called servant leadership theory. Now, to the world and to corporate America, it was a pretty groundbreaking approach. However, to Bible believing Christians, it sounded a lot like the carpenter who washed his disciples' feet. Servant leadership theory teaches that leaders that their leadership should be about serving others rather than self-interest or preserving power or exercising power. Leaders should focus on prioritizing other people's needs. Leaders should develop their employees. Leaders should benefit stakeholders. And in servant leadership theory, the servant leaders, they focus on listening and empathy. They develop skills of persuasion, not coercion. Servant leaders, they're committed to other people's growth. Servant leaders are coaches. Servant leaders also consider the needs of numerous stakeholders, and servant leaders are community builders. Servant leaders aren't focused on preserving their power or lording over their followers. Rather, servant leaders, they embrace service and deny themselves and discipline themselves. Do you display servant leadership when it comes to winning souls? What do you do to win souls? And are you willing to deny yourself? Are you willing to discipline yourself? Today, we're going to return to our study of First Corinthians, and we're finishing the ninth chapter. And we're in the second of two main sections of the letter. And during the second section, Paul was answering these ethical questions that the Corinthian Christians wrote to him about. For example, he first addressed issues related to marriage and singleness in chapter 7. And he called us to live according to our calling. If we're married, we should live sacrificial lives. If we're single, we should live self-controlled lives. And second, in chapter 8, he began addressing the issue of what to do with food that had been sacrificed to idols. And he first talked about how idols were non-entities. And Christians they really have a lot of freedom related to the issue. However, he was quick to say that we should not take advantage of our freedom, but rather sacrifice our freedom in order to love the weaker brother. The point about loving the weaker brother, it's led now Paul into a discussion about sacrificing rights. You see, Paul sacrificed his right to receive financial gain for his gospel ministry. And he used that as an example of how we can sacrifice rights to advance the gospel. So he was willing to be a servant leader in order to win souls. Today, God's going to call us to win souls. However, more specifically, that's going to require us to be servant leaders, leaders who deny ourselves and discipline ourselves. The first thing I want you to see is this call to deny yourself to win souls. Look at 1 Corinthians 9:19. For though I am free from all, I have made myself a servant to all, that I might win more of them. To the Jews I became as a Jew, in order to win Jews. To those under the law I became as one under the law, though not being myself under the law, that I might win those under the law. To those outside the law I became as one outside the law, not being outside the law of God, but under the law of Christ, that I might win those who were outside the law. To the weak I became weak, that I might win the weak. I become all things to all people, that by all means I might save some. And I do it all for the sake of the gospel, that I may share with them in its blessing. Again, the previous section was Paul explaining how he sacrificed his rights for the gospel. He had the right to material gain from his gospel ministry, but he sacrificed that right. He sacrificed that right in order to proclaim the free gospel freely. Therefore, Paul didn't want his didn't view his freedom as an opportunity to pursue his own self-interest. Rather, he viewed his freedom as an opportunity to sacrifice and become a servant to all. He could lead as an apostle in an authoritarian way, but he followed Jesus's example, and he led as a servant. This servant image is a new image in the discussion about sacrificing rights. And simply, servants are those who serve others. Servants perform their duties for the benefit of others. Therefore, being a servant is about denying rights rather than claiming or protecting rights. Going back to servant leadership theory, Robert Greenleaf argued that the most effective leaders, they didn't have a posture of leader first, but rather others first. And more specifically, he developed an approach to leadership that focused on growing followers. His approach taught leaders to develop their people through listening and understanding and building community and persuasion, not coercion, and through developing awareness and overall health. In short, servant leadership is about putting other people before the product, or understanding that maybe people are the product. Paul was explaining that his leadership as an apostle was about putting people first. But notice in verse 19 that Paul was not focused on a particular subset of people, but he wanted to be a servant of all, as he said. His approach to ministry was not putting Jews first or Gentiles first, but all people first. He denied his rights and freedoms for all people. That meant that Paul took what is called an incarnational approach to ministry. He wasn't about come to me, but rather I'll go to you. Incarnational ministry requires a leader to deny preferences. And in verse 19, it also gives us the purpose of Paul's denial. The reason why he denied himself was in order to win more souls. Do you see that? He curbed his freedoms and his preferences for gospel ends. He denied himself all sorts of cultural freedoms in order to see more converted to Jesus. Paul was a missionary, and a missionary to all types of people. He chose a posture of servanthood, putting others first, denying preferences, all so that he could win souls to Jesus. Ultimately, 1 Corinthians 9:19 is about mission. But again, Paul's denial was for all kinds of people. He said he desired to be a servant of all, verse 19. Then in verse 20 to 22, he explains that he was a servant to three groups of people. He was an incarnational servant missionary to Jews, to Gentiles, and then to the weak. So Paul denied his preferences in order to win Jewish souls. For example, in Acts 18:18, we read that about Paul cutting his hair as a vow. Most likely, this was what was called a Nazirite vow, which included consecrating oneself as part of temple worship. Paul was Jewish, and this was a very Jewish practice. It was an example of Paul embracing Jewish customs in order to build gospel bridges and win Jewish souls. So he said in verse 20, to the Jews, I became as a Jew in order to win Jews. However, Paul also denied his preferences in order to win Gentile souls. Gentile in the Bible simply refers to someone who is not ethnically Jewish. A mark of the Jewish covenant relationship with God was the sign of circumcision. However, with the coming of Christ, there was no longer a need for this religious rite. Therefore, in Acts 15, Paul visits Jerusalem for this great leadership council. And the purpose of it was to discuss if Gentiles needed to participate in this Jewish religious rite. Ultimately, they determined that all people, Jew and Gentile, were, quote, saved through the grace of the Lord Jesus, Acts 15:11. And as a result, Gentiles did not need to be circumcised. This is a really important theological point, but it had significant missionary implications. The point was that Paul, the missionary, was not trying to turn Gentiles into Jews. Rather, he was wisely navigating the culture. And Paul, as he says in verse 21, became as one outside the law, that I might win those outside the law. And finally, third, Paul also denied his preferences in order to win weak souls. And if you'll remember from the previous passages, the weaker brother, he was the one whose conscience was was sensitive to the degree that if he saw a leader like Paul eating food sacrificed to idols, it would harm his weak faith. Therefore, Paul was sensitive to their sensitivities. There was a gentleness about his missionary approach. So, as missionaries, we have to live within this tension of truth and cultural sensitivity. We have to be courageous to stand for truth. Without biblical truth, no souls will be won. We see Paul courageously proclaiming the truth in passages like Romans 1, where he talks about the wrath of God on the unrighteous. However, we also see examples of Paul displaying really wise cultural sensitivity in places like Acts 17, where he preaches on Mars Hill and he talks about how Greek philosophers had reached their limits and they had created space for an unknown God. And then Paul says that he knows that one true God. This means that we need to preach the truth, but also be careful about throwing needless truth grenades. Some people are called to really hard ministries, but I don't think we should be needlessly provocative if it closes hearts and minds to the gospel. You see, in the end, like Paul, good missionaries become all things to all people. Good missionaries take an incarnational approach. Paul said that he culturally adapted so that by all means I might save some, verse 22. For example, Lottie Moon was the great Southern Baptist missionary to China. We've named our annual missions offering after her. She once said that I am more and more impressed by the belief that to win these people to God, we must first win them to ourselves. And as a result, what Lottie Moon did is she learned the Chinese language. She dressed in Chinese clothes and she cut her hair according to Chinese styles and she lived sensitive to Chinese customs. And like Paul before her, Lottie Moon took an incarnational approach. She denied her preferences and became all things to all people so that she might save some. Therefore, Paul ends with a concluding missionary principle in verse 23. He says, I do it all for the sake of the gospel, that I may share with them in its blessings. Indeed, friends, believers have rights. Christians have freedoms. We all certainly have preferences. However, the missionary call is to sacrifice and servitude. We're to be servant leaders who deny our preferences in order to win souls. We're to do it all for the sake of the gospel, verse 23. In other words, we're to deny our preferences and become servant leaders in order to share the blessing of the gospel. That was Paul's missionary approach. We see his approach in the life of a historical missionary like Lottie Moon, but what about you? How do you need to deny yourself in order to win souls? Friends, who has God brought into your path that you can share the blessing of the gospel? Do you need to become a servant in some way to share that blessing? Do you need to say something or maybe not say something in a certain sensitive way? Do you need to be willing to change your behavior in order to be more effective? Do you need to participate maybe in a new activity in order to win that person? Do you need to disengage with some of your interest and engage in someone else's interest? Missionaries, they deny preferences in order to win souls. Missionaries are called to all types of people. Therefore, we're to deny our freedoms and become servants in order for all to hear the blessing of the gospel. This is the Christian life. That's the Christian call. And we're never to retire from the call. In other words, the missionary call is a lifelong calling. Therefore, we need to persevere. But how? The second point I want you to see is this call to discipline yourself to win souls. Look at verses 24 to 27 with me. Do you not know that in a race all the runners run, but only one receives the prize? Do run that you may obtain it. Every athlete exercises self-control in all things. They do it to receive a perishable wreath, but we an imperishable. So I do not run aimlessly. I do not box as one beating the air, but I discipline my body and keep it under control, least after preaching to others, I myself should be disqualified. Paul explained that not only did he deny his preferences and sacrifice his rights in order to proclaim the gospel to all people, but he also disciplined himself to win souls. He wanted to persevere as a missionary. Paul understood that Jesus' call to win souls and make disciples, it was a lifelong calling. Paul gave himself completely to the missionary task to the degree that he disciplined himself in order to win souls. And if you'll notice, he used three images to explain how he disciplined himself. Paul ran the race to receive the prize. Paul exercised self-control to receive an imperishable wreath. And third, Paul punched with purpose. First, run the race to receive the prize. Missionary work is like a race. It can be weary at times. It takes all of who we are. Paul was concerned with how we run the race. We're to run the missionary race in a way that we win the race. We're to discipline ourselves in a way that we run to win. In other words, we're to give it our best. We're not to give ourselves apathetically to winning souls. We're not to give our best to our vocations and then our leftovers to our ministry. We have one shot at this life to make a maximum impact, and we're to leave it all on the field. Do you run the missionary race to win? Do you discipline yourself to win souls? Well, second, exercise self-control to receive the imperishable wreath. In order to receive the prize, we have to suppress appetites. Eternal reward awaits for the faithful missionary. However, in this life, it's going to mean restraining the longings of the flesh. Self-control might mean giving up on unrealistic expectations and overly idealistic ambitions. Self-control might also mean developing daily spiritual disciplines. Self-control might also mean choosing healthy physical habits like sleep and exercise and healthy diets. Self-control most certainly means fighting the desires of the flesh. What do you need to suppress in order to be an effective missionary? And third, punch with purpose. As missionaries, we're to run to win, which means we're to give our best and we're to serve with excellence. As missionaries, we're to exercise self-control, and that means we're to suppress appetites and restrain desires. But also, as missionaries, we're not to run aimlessly, verse 26, or box as one beating the air. Rather, we're to carry out the missionary task with intentionality and with purpose. He's given you limited time and resources and energy. Maximize your impact. Don't waste the time and money and energy that God's given you. Carry out your missionary calling with maximum purpose and impact. Have you thought through who you're investing in and how you're serving and giving? And friends, hear Paul's sober warning in verse 27. Unless you discipline yourself to win souls, you run the real risk of disqualifying yourself. Do you see it? Discipline is how you win the race. It's how you win the imperishable wreath. And without discipline, your ministry will be subpar. Without discipline, you will give in to your fleshly desires. Without discipline, your ministry will be thoughtless and ineffective. Discipline yourself to win souls and don't be disqualified. In other words, finish strong. As years went by, I gained an increasing appreciation for John MacArthur. Of course, no one's perfect, and we're never going to fully agree with everyone. However, I was so thankful for MacArthur's commitment to the Word and to sound teaching. I also appreciated that he finished strong. I got to go visit Grace Community Church a few years before he passed away, and I was curious how much energy he would have, and I was so encouraged by how energetic he was. There was a lot of life in that voice. MacArthur was also a really needed voice during the pandemic. I appreciated how he led in those years, and in fact, as faithful teachers from the past 30 years have begun to leave the stage and pass away, I was especially grateful during the pandemic for MacArthur's leadership. Those times were confusing and challenging, and I was just thankful that he was still alive and still energetic and still engaged in a moment where we needed him. Um, R.C. Sproul passed away in 2017. His voice was really missed during those pandemic years, and around 2021, there was a picture that floated around of MacArthur and Sproul together. They were friends, and the picture was of them playing golf. And many observed that even though they were born in the same year, they were the same age, MacArthur looked noticeably healthier. You see, R.C. Sproul was a smoker, and at the end of his life, he needed to carry around an oxygen tank. Uh, and even though they were born the same year, MacArthur lived 8 years longer, and during those 8 years, that included the pandemic years. Many pastors on social media talked about that picture, and it became a little lesson, a little reminder to fight for health in order to finish strong. Friends, your discipline matters. Finish strong. How do you need to discipline yourself in order to win souls? Do you need to give energy and excellence to that ministry that God's given you? Do you need to renew your resolve and keep fighting that long, hard fight to kill the flesh? Do you need to punch with purpose, narrowing that jab for maximum impact? Do you need to take better care of yourself in order to proclaim the blessings of the gospel to more people for more years? Friend, your discipline matters. Finish strong. Discipline yourself to win souls. If you're wondering how to be a missionary and win souls, one of the simplest ways to be a missionary is just to lean on your local church. Participate in our monthly Hands and Feet projects. Bring a Thanksgiving meal next Sunday, and then show up on Tuesday, November 25th. Invite a friend to Sunday worship. Each week, they're going to make new friends with other Christians, and they're going to hear a gospel message from the Bible. However, some of you also need to really hear another point. You need to hear the admonition to lead. We have a lot of great servants in this church, but I'm going to be frank. We feel like we have a deficiency of servant leaders. For about a year, our elders have been unified on this point, and we're really trying to own this reality that we haven't done a good job of not only calling people to leadership and servant leadership, but really developing servant leaders. So we're focused on developing discipleship and leadership pipelines because we're having trouble raising up new small group leaders and starting new small groups. Here's a reality that really troubles me. Our church is 12 years old, and basically every small group in this church has been started by a staff member for 12 years. Friends, I've never seen that in a church. I've never seen that it has to lean so much on its staff just to start small groups. So we're going to try to raise up new servant leaders to start small groups and new ministries. We're trying to raise up new servant leaders to serve as trustees and deacons. And I want you to hear that our elder team is really owning that we're not doing a good job of developing servant leaders. But I also want you to hear that we're not going to let our foot off the gas. We might keep pestering you, but we're committed to developing better ways to equip the saints, and we're going to be even more intentional to call people to servant leadership. Servants to deny and discipline yourself in order to win souls, and lean on Redeemer Church to serve and invite and to lead. Um, this week, I reached out to a good friend who he was a regional director for the International Mission Board, and I shared that, okay, hey, I'm preaching from 1 Corinthians 9, and I was going to reference Lottie Moon, but I was really looking for contemporary examples of effective incarnational missionaries, and I wish I had the time to share all that he shared because it was so challenging, it was so inspiring. But a couple of examples that he shared with me really struck me. It struck me because they were from two radically different contexts. One example was was in a massive urban setting, while the second example was in really extreme rural poverty. One couple, they sacrificially served a city of 11 million people. They took an incarnational approach. They denied their cultural preferences. They disciplined themselves for effective ministry. They were respectful of the custom. It was slow at first because the city was about 90% Muslim, and many were violently hostile to Christ. However, as this couple built relationships, they shared the gospel, and a small group was converted. And leaning on family lines and social circles, the missionaries discipled the converts into these small house churches. However, just as the work was really and finally producing fruit, the wife became ill and they had to come back to the States. 5 years later, they were able to return, and to their great joy, that incarnational approach, it was still producing converts. It was still producing disciples in house churches all over that massive Muslim city. God used them to win thousands of souls. But then there was this second couple that my friend talked about, and they lived in a radically different context. They were called to this tiny, impoverished village in the mountains. They also took an incarnational approach. They denied their cultural preferences. They disciplined themselves for effective ministry. They wore the same clothes as their neighbors. They lived in the same type of bamboo huts that was up on stilts as their neighbors, and they were up on stilts so that they could keep the animals and the pigs underneath. And this might sound gross, I'm sorry, but they also ate the same food as their neighbors, even though they had to regularly fight dysentery as a result. And again, it was slow at first, but after 30 years, they've been used by God to win souls not only in that little village, but all the surrounding villages as well. Friends, God is still using ordinary, faithful Christians to win souls and save some. Isn't that good news? I'll leave you with this. Missionaries also talk about no people. You get the phrase, right? Those are the people that aren't part of polite society. No. Maybe they're hard to get to know because they struggle in some way. Maybe they're hard to get to know because of maybe a language barrier. Maybe to a Jew, the no people are the Gentiles. Maybe to the Gentiles, the no people are the Jews. And maybe to the strong, the no people are the weak. However, aren't you eternally grateful that Jesus didn't treat you as one of the no people? Aren't you eternally grateful that he incarnated himself and came to you? Aren't you eternally grateful that like the woman at the well, Jesus didn't ignore you like everybody else ignored that poor woman? Brothers and sisters, aren't you eternally grateful that he emptied himself by taking the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of men, and being found in human form? He humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on the cross. Philippians 2:7-8. Servants, deny and discipline yourself in order to win souls.